Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, July 20th, 2025. Today we have a fascinating conversation in store for you, which derives from a now famous statement made by Sir Arthur C. Clarke, his third law, which states that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And today we'll have ample examples of that in the realm of computer science. But first, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel, including our current Vice Chairman and Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Scholarship, Dan Elton, our Director of Citizen and Community Science and 2024 U.S. Vice Presidential candidate, Daniel Tweed, and our Technology Advisor and Foreign Ambassador in Spain, Dr. Jose Cordero. And our special guest today, returning for the second time to our Virtual Enlightenment Salon, is Eric Hennigan. He is a senior software engineer at Google and also a volunteer genomics data scientist at the University of Southern California. He holds Bachelor of Sciences degrees in Applied Mathematics and Physics from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a PhD in Computer Science from the University of California, Irvine. He enjoys communicating what he has learned to others and even acted as instructor of record for UCI and Cal State Fullerton while still a graduate student. And despite his formal education, he recommends self-study as a path to skills improvement. And some of his self-study has led him to fascinating discoveries and insights, which he synthesizes from time to time into quite fascinating presentations. And the one you will hear today is indeed among them. It is called Computer Science and Its Occult. And it seems, Eric, that you are wearing some interesting attire for this presentation, which is actually quite relevant, and it will be explained in due time. But Eric, welcome, and please go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction, Gennady. I'm very happy to be here with the transhumanists and to give what I hope to be quite entertaining presentation and conversation about the parallels of practicing programming and being a magician. So I believe, after careful reflection, that we are modern magicians. I do happen to work for the Google, but I'm not representing them here. I am just having some fun with this connection. So we have a joke in computer science about naming things. It is one of the two hard problems. So there are naming things and cache validation and off by one errors. Those are our two hard problems. But the reason naming things is quite difficult, it's not just because they have power, but it's because the world changes over time. So the name that you may have originally given something doesn't quite fit after a few months because your space has changed, your customers want something different. And then you're just sort of stuck with that old name, even though it's ill-fitting. I was thinking about how this relates to magic, because in many magical stories, once you have the power, once you have the name of something, you get power and mastery over that thing. And it occurred to me that the true name of anything within a program is its memory address. Once you have the memory address, then you can alter the value of what is stored there, and you have true power over its contents. So memory addresses are the true names for the software engineers. And the first rule, of course, you don't want to allow anybody to have the name if you do not want to give them permission to edit the content there. So we definitely make a lot of effort within the structure of programming in order to encapsulate those names and share them only when we need the other party to make edits or modifications. So controlling your variables and controlling the values is a very important part of writing a program that is understandable and that works well into the future. It appeared I jumped ahead a little bit, right? The three things, or the two things that we have problems with are cache invalidation and naming things and off by one error. So I already revealed that joke to you, which is fine. And what can true names do, right? This cartoon encapsulates what I'm saying. We have the man in the black hat who is possibly in control of the XKCD universe, and a poor programmer who is trying to engage in, I think, bettering their gameplay, and asks for a few pointers. Of course, the man in the black hat gives him memory addresses, and this is not of any use to the poor game designer or player. So, oh well. But that really just emphasizes the point. When you're a magician, these are the values that make sense for you. These are the ones that give you the power. And when you're an ordinary mortal, they are completely useless and not very well understood. Another interesting aspect of magic is that you can control a demon, or at least trap it, with a salt circle. So if you are to summon a demon, you do not want it to get out free into the world. You want to keep it sort of in a controlled space so that you can interact with it safely. And the way to do that is to form a salt circle. Now, in 2018, there's this wonderful artist, I believe in Europe, Great Britain, and he thought, oh, these autonomous vehicles, they are following the lines on the road. And sure, they're autonomous, but what would happen if you were to paint the lines on the road in such a way that it surrounds the vehicle? And it turns out at that time, the vehicle is just trapped. So if you were to paint these lines with salt, then you are essentially trapping a demon and preventing it from getting loose onto the roadway, right? So these are just like really fun ways of playing with the idea that computer science or programming is a magical art. We can actually use salt circles to trap some of our devices. As recently as 2023, you were able to confuse one of the autonomous vehicles merely by placing a cone on the hood of the vehicle. So it was not enjoying that sort of data, and it would pause and not drive anymore and not hit anyone. And it's a really clever, low-cost way of disabling such a device if you don't want it running around on your streets. Now, we know for sure that the operators of, in this case, it looks like Waymo, they're going to have to come by and remove the cone at some point. But just really hilarious way of partitioning off what is magic from what is not, just with a low-cost hack. And if you know these, it turns out that magic is a collection of such hacks. And engineers just learn these things over time. Where do we learn them? It turns out that we have special schools. No, they're not really that special. It's universities. They're kind of like Hogwarts, I guess. No, this is really just the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, famously CSAIL. And at these schools, we train the engineers over 4 years with all the tips and tricks of the trade. And so upon graduation, then they can do things that ordinary people cannot do because they haven't learned. Now, there is a way to speed up this process. You don't have to get a degree in order to be a programmer. You can actually just learn all the content online within about a year or so. It's very short, very low cost. Our magical enterprise is not very well protected. In fact, we are encouraging people to join in and giving away the knowledge for free online if you know where to look for it. The schools, though, are not the only thing that makes computer science as a practice of magic identifiable. There is another really interesting thing. We have a special attire, and it turns out to be the hoodie, right? So I did a quick image search for hacker, and all of them are dressed in hoodies, which I find delightful, right? So here we go, ghostly figures at a keyboard, prying into the secret belly of what operates today's society and making small tweaks and modifications. So just, you can recognize us through our special clothing, which very amusing, very amusing. At the schools, we received magic lessons. It turns out that this lesson in particular, which I don't want to play here because it's a full hour on its own, is Gerald Sussman. He's a teacher at MIT, and he has written a book on the structure and interpretation of computer programs, which in this particular lecture, he's talking about the metacircular evaluator, which I will describe a little bit more in detail later. What I really enjoy about this lecture is he decided that this was like the magic part of the entire class. And so for this lecture, he wears a fez and explicitly talks about how that lecture will be an investigation into the magic of what makes Lisp as language work and how to implement it. Let's see if I can skip past the video. Play it. Okay. In these classes, we learn how to make spells. This is one of our oldest spells. As you can tell, it's on a punch card. Our modern spells are stored as plain text files, which is much more easy for us magicians to read and write and manipulate, to share and review. But in the early days, the computers were not quite so advanced, and we used punch cards. And I think this just emphasizes the esoteric nature of what it means to be a programmer. If I were around and had to use this technology, I would. Right? The fact that I can use more convenient things like text makes my abilities much more powerful because it's faster and it scales better. But it's not the thing that motivates me. The thing that motivates me is just describing what an algorithm does or what a computer should do. And if this is the interface, that is what I would learn to use, and it would be all the more esoteric for having to go through that process. And it is quite amazing that as humans, we've figured out how to build such things. And if I want to take a brief aside, since this talk is really just about fun. The punch card originates from the loom all the way back in the early industrialization of our technology. So when you are weaving a fabric, my fabric happens to have a sort of brocade in it, and that you probably cannot see. But these patterns needed to be described by the operator at the loom, and eventually that led to a little bit of mechanization, and the way to describe which threads are up and which threads are down in the weave was through a punch card. And that was early industrialization, and it just bled in through to using computers as well, because the absence or presence of a hole in the card is something that a machine is able to read. We have many spells. One of the earliest ones, if you are a computer science engineer and you go through the program, is to learn about sorting. And there are many ways to sort, like quick sort and merge sort, and tree sort, and all sorts of things. They each have their trade-offs, right? Their best, average, and worst case performances, and how much space they take up when you're operating. But I highlight the sorting spells in particular because there's a Harry Potter reference here. How it's one of the basic things that computer scientists do, which is to categorize the data into different places. And once categorized, to maybe give it an index. And once it's indexed, to be able to find it, right? And sorting plays a very critical role in all of that infrastructure. There are many more esoteric spells that we have. So the computer scientists among you might recognize this one. It is I didn't give the function name here. Well, it says send. But this is a way to just copy data from one place to another. And you can see the addresses, the *2 and the *from. We're going to copy data from one place to another. As a computer scientist reading this, it really breaks your brain because you have a switch sort of nested inside of a do-while loop, or the do-while loop is nested inside of the switch, and they're sort of intermixed and interplayed. And that is not a normal thing that you would do in a program. In fact, many of the modern languages, the structured programming languages, don't even allow you to write this. And this is called Duff's device. It was created in order to copy data from one place to another. I think it was done by Duff at LucasArts, to copy data from one place to another as efficiently as possible. He thought about, well, how would I do this if I were writing assembler? And this is how he would do it. And then he translated that assembly into C code. And lo and behold, it compiled, even though nobody had written anything like this with this structure for like 10 or 13 years of the C compiler existing. So it was quite a surprise that such a challenging syntax even ran through and did the right thing without having some weird error or complaint. And again, the modern languages don't even let you nest these structures. You have to have them separate. There's another one which I find quite amusing because it is really, really abusing things. So I'll step through it a little bit. We have a float, and it's just half of x. And then we have an integer derived from that float. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, take the address of the float, treat it as if it were the address of an integer, and then dereference that. So what this does is it's going to give you the floating point bits and interpret them as if they were an integer. So there's no changes here to the bits. There's no changes to the bits. But float values are not something you would ever treat as an integer because you're just going to get some weird, crazy number because of the way that the floats encode the data they have. It's not a sensical integer. And then after that, what we're going to do with that nonsensical integer, we're going to take this other crazy number, OX5F, like blah, 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 that we pull out of a hat somewhere, it's not explained, crazy number, and just subtract that integer shifted one bit over. So I think that's a divide the integer in half and then subtract it. And then that's a new number of bit, like in bit representation, it's a new number. And what we're going to do is we're going to take it, like the computer thinks it's an integer now. So we'll take its address, treat it as a pointer to a float, dereference the float. So now we take those raw bits and treat them as a float again. Crazy thing to do. Just take the raw bits and shuffle them around. Wild thing to do. But it turns out this is an extremely important piece of software because it operates extraordinarily quickly. It was written for game rendering, in this case Doom, and it computes, I give you the function name now at the top, it computes the inverse square root, which is something to do if you're doing any kind of triangulation, like a squared equals b squared plus c squared, you want to take the square root of that other side and find the distance to what you're looking at. And this little computation does exactly that. There's more information on Wikipedia about how the mathematical genius behind this trick and where that magic number comes from. I'm surprised that it works at all, and I'm doubly surprised that someone was smart enough to find it. We also have special languages in our field, right? There's actually a huge number of them. You may recognize languages such as C++ or Python or Java, JavaScript. There's other languages, HTML, not a programming language, but a formatting language. We've made many different specialized languages for each of the different things that we might want a computer to do. For example, I've recently been learning OpenSCAD, which is a language for describing 3D shapes that you might want to print on a 3D printer or cut with a computerized mill. And it turns out that all of these things we've recognized and abstracted a particular kind of pattern to language itself. And that's the real power of computer science, is kind of an offshoot of mathematics studying language, structured languages meant for machines, but readable by people. And we found out that this is a book by Nicholas Wirth, my grand advisor, so my advisor's advisor at graduate school. And Wirth identified that algorithms and data structures together make a program. And I'll explain a little bit what that means. So we have this mind-bending recursion. What we got on one side with the very clear lines, those are various kinds of data structures. It looks like they are put in a linked list of some kind, so you can walk through them. But there's something that looks like a tree, one that looks like a graph, on the bottom something that looks like a skip list. And these are just ways of arranging the data and what points to what, and we describe this to each other with the diagram. That's the data structure part, and they're really cool, and we study them in school. Now, it turns out if you are to take a computer language and you want to do something like automate the translation of the text that a human writes into the operational codes that a machine executes, so you have to make a translation between the programming language and the assembly that runs, then the way to make that translation is to parse the language that the human has written into a data structure that you can operate on. And that's what's represented by the more black box. As you can see, there's a lot of different linguistic elements, but what you end up with is you end up kind of like with a data flow or a control flow that shows the moving pieces of what the programmer is talking about when they're writing their code. And with that, the compiler can treat the input as a graph and make all the changes and operations and transforms that it needs to do one piece at a time, and spit out the assembly at the end that the computer can execute. So we have this interesting thing that what we consider as programs are the things that we are able to be writing and making and operating on, right? So there's a bit of recursion here. Programs are not just things that you run, like your web browser that you run or a calculator that you run to get a particular result. They're also a thing that can self-describe, which gives it an enormous amount of magical power. We have special spell books. Here I highlight again the structure and interpretation of computer programs, but any graduate that goes through the program is going to accumulate 1 or 2 books for each of their classes. And at the end, they'll have maybe a dozen books about how to program and how to do various things in various languages and design and software engineering and all sorts of stuff. Here I highlight again the metacircular evaluator because it's the program that is able to take a program and run the program, right? So it is of a special nature. It's not just taking any kind of input, 3 plus 5, and generating any kind of output, 8. It is taking a computer program in text as input, and it is spitting out the operation that that text says that you should do. And it itself is one of those programs. So it can run itself, which is an amazing piece of mathematical genius. I don't have a slide on this. That Alan Turing discovered is that once you have a certain amount of computation, it's universal. That machine can be used to describe other copies of itself and to emulate those the execution of those copies. And this is one of the genius things that we do as computer scientists. There's a lot of cultural impacts that computer science has made, right? It's not just that we completely change the way everybody works by putting them on a computer, but we see many different references to computer science in popular culture. So here's Arthur C. Clarke. Any advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's mostly because the details are hidden, they're complicated. Only a trained person can figure out those details and work with them. It's a magician's enterprise. But here in Babylon 5, for anybody that was around to watch that during the 90s, there is a character that plays, I think, only for a couple of episodes, and he's a technomage. His job is using technology to make really flashy presentations like a stage magician would do. And I see, when you look at the back end of any concert or anything, they have audio engineers, they've got computers, they've got their software they use. Like, a lot of this is driven by output from this magical field just for the purposes of entertainment, which is really cool. Like even South Park, which looks like cardboard cutouts, is all computer animated. So we're using amazingly powerful devices to emulate the effect of cardboard cutout. For anyone that's watched Adventure Time, there's also a very sad story about the Wizard King and his wife, Betty. And both of them become a wizard and a witch, respectively. Poor Simon loses his mind, and Betty dramatically pursues trying to, reunite with him, but alters herself in the process so much that rebirth of their relationship can no longer occur. So it's a very sad story, but it's one of struggle and development, and it's one of magic and computer science. Because in one of these episodes, they are going through the crown that has made Simon crazy, and Betty's trying to debug it. So here she appears as a floating head of an avatar, and she is really quite capable of looking through all the circuitry in that crown, right? And having a technological crown that makes you a wizard is kind of really emphasizing this occult computer science aspect. And they go through the crown, and she is not, she sees that she is not able to fix it so that she can have her husband back, which is really quite a sad outcome. But we got a techno mage and a techno wizard here in a cartoon, just showing up for fun and delight and drama. I was talking about this similarity between computer programming and computer science and magician with my family, and they said, oh, you know what? There's this guy that's written a whole bunch of books, The Laundry Files, Charlie Strauss, about exactly that coincidence. Now, I haven't gone and read any of these yet. I have read other works from him, and it was quite enjoyable, so I will probably read these and expect them to be enjoyable as well. But they all also predicated on the idea that anybody operating as a computer scientist or as a programmer is essentially acting as a wizard. And he really emphasizes that duality in his books. Now, I'd like to turn our attention a little bit to an old Jewish story called the Golem of Prague. And according to the legend, there's Rabbi Loew, and his community within Prague was under attack, being terrorized by the surrounding Gentiles, and they were facing a sort of extreme situation. So what he did is he decided that he would go down to the river and he would take some clay and he would shape it into a guardian. And then he would write some Hebrew script, a prayer, essentially, that contains a code, because it turns out in the Jewish alphabet also doubles as numerical symbols. So their first letter, alpha, is considered 1. And we can do the same with ours from A to Z, 1 through 26. They do the same with theirs. And so you can kind of treat a sequence of Hebrew letters as if it were a sequence of numbers. And if you have that mindset, you can say, oh, well, this is saying something in a code that might allow you to engage in magic. And the Rabbi Loew did exactly that. He wrote down the Hebrew script. It contained a certain name of God and animation. He feeds it to the guardian. This picture doesn't have a mouth, but in some of the stories, he is giving that scroll into the mouth of the guardian, who is able to process and execute those descriptions as a program. And that program is act as the guardian for the Jewish community in Prague and protect it from these attacks. One of the interesting things to highlight in this story and in subsequent Jewish literature is they identified the ability to speak and the ability to name things, like from Genesis, as a very strong power. And so the golem itself is not allowed to speak because it should not have this power. It is a wordless slave that executes the commands that you write on the scroll. And you have to be very careful about those commands because like any computer scientist will tell you, the computer does exactly what you tell it to do. And that may be different than what you intended to tell it to do. And this is a problem that continually crops up and why our programs have various bugs. It's an enormous complexity to get all of the little details perfectly. And some of our intentions are themselves in conflict, and it's difficult to resolve them. So here, the Jewish mythology is identifying the problem. It's like, you can say what you say, but the interpretation of that by the machine might be quite literal and not what you intended. So be careful how you say things. And the reason I highlight this story is because I think as a field, we are engaged in doing exactly this. So we have gone into the world and we have taken silicon, which happens to be like from sand in riverbeds, and purified it and baked it into crystals, because all, as we know from stories of Atlantis, all advanced civilizations are based on crystals. So we bake the stuff into a crystal, and then we etch particular patterns into it. And at this point, we're so advanced and pushing these patterns so small that we're using X-ray lithography. And some of these circuit traces are like 2 nanometers. And we're running nearly up against the limit that a transistor can't be smaller than an atom. So we're hitting some hard limits here, but this approach, like we took the sand, made a crystal, we give it some particular patterns. We have a way of animating it with electricity to bring it alive so that it can do things. And the earliest versions of this were computer circuits that did calculations. So some of the earliest things that we wanted to do were for accounting and census taking by the US government. We made a bunch of computers for that. The military was very interested in using computers for calculating the trajectory of their weapons. So we made, that used to be done with like book tables, and then we automated it into a computer so that you can aim your weapons properly and account for wind and drag and all the other things. So then out of that comes modeling physics and modeling the world. All of this stuff, very exciting, all animated by electricity and, you know, the operationalization of mathematics in our world, right? So once you have the circuitry, then we start a process of, oh, if we arrange the circuitry in a particular way, then maybe it can do arbitrary computation, and I can just write a script and it will execute that script, right? So I don't have a circuit that's only doing mathematical calculations like an 8-digit calculator in your pocket, but now it can do anything I program it to do. And so we invent these spells, these scripts that we can give to the computer and do anything we want. Here it looks like we have a Logo the turtle, and you program Logo the turtle to just like take a few steps forward and turn left or right. And once it does that and you put it in a loop, it does that repeatedly, then you can get these nifty spirograph-like patterns. After doing all those things, what's the next problem to solve? Right now I can do arbitrary stuff. The next problem to solve is, oh, can it learn to do things on its own? Because it is awfully tedious for me to describe to the computer what I want it to do in every single circumstance. And in many cases, I don't know myself how to write that program. So for example, for a self-driving car, it has to take imagery data and LiDAR data and parse that into a representation of the world, and then make a decision about how to move left or right or avoid an obstacle, identify the obstacles, park, wait for various things. Like, this is a huge number of different concerns to try and program. There's no way that humans are going to get all those details right. So what we did instead is we figured out, oh, how do our brains operate? Well, we've got these little neurons and they connect together and they fire signals at each other. Okay, can we make a mathematical model of that? Yes, we can. And it looks an awful lot like some matrix multiplications. And so we make that model, and then we get the computer to go through training exercises where it's first getting everything wrong, and then we tweak all the weights in the model, the little values of these matrix multiplies. And over time, it starts getting the answer that we consider the correct answer for the examples that we have. And the computer is now able to learn. This is extremely convenient for us because now we can solve problems for which our ordinary scripting languages are not suitable in describing the solution to. But it's also a very dangerous aspect because now the computer can learn, and so it can do a lot of things that we may not have anticipated or may not desire for it to do. One of the very first things, ignoring the Jewish literature that told us not to do this, that we decided to do is get it to write. So one of the very early programs was ELIZA, which acts as a therapist, and it's sort of hard-coded to give these various responses. Most of them are questions. And it turned out, like this was very much a long time ago. This is not using a neural net or anything. It turned out that the people who wrote this found it effective as a therapist because the questions forced them to think up answers, and that's actually most of the benefit of therapy, is that you're just reflecting on why and what and how. And even though they knew the trick, it still was effective, which is really cool. But they can write. And now we know, like if you've ever interacted with ChatGPT or Gemini or Perplexity or any of these models, you know that one of the things that they can write is computer code, which is, you know, skirting on the edge of, well, if they can write computer code, maybe they can optimize the code that we already have that teaches them how to learn. And then if we put that into a feedback loop, off they go on their own. We also taught it to speak, to replicate sound. This was one of the early things that, I forget his name. Ray Kurzweil worked on is a speech-to-text synthesizer, right? And this is, speech-to-text is actually really, really important for a handful of people that don't have the ability to see anything, but do have the ability to hear, right? So it's very important for them. But it also happens to be very convenient for the rest of us that instead of reading an article, which I can't do as I'm washing the dishes because my eyes are busy looking at the dishes, I can listen to the article instead. And same with driving. Lots of us are doing a commute and we can listen to articles and books using this technology. But again, the danger is there. The computers are now able to talk to us. We also taught the computer how to paint. This is a montage of some of the earlier images. Each release, I noticed these are getting much, much better, which is really quite amazing and possibly faster than humans learn how to draw. The fact that it can do so many styles is also really quite remarkable. It has an enormous collection of knowledge that it has received from, gobbling and consuming the entire internet and whatever else these companies are able to find. But all of these skills raise some important questions. What does it say about us? So we got here by by observing how do our neurons at a cellular level operate, turn that into a mathematical model, operationalize the model with some computer code so that it can be executed, and then scaling it up to many billions or trillions of neurons, what they call parameters in the model. Are our brains also doing this? Not exactly in the same way, but in a very similar way. And so are we just programmed by our life experience? Well, there's a lot to say, yes, we are. Are we computers? No, not in a fixed silicon sense. Do we compute? Yes, we absolutely compute. We can add digits and do various other things and make decisions. So building something similar to us really highlights our differences and leads to increased understanding of ourselves. That begins to be a little bit scary. How do we make one of these things, more like a person? So at the moment, they have an extraordinary amount of knowledge, but they may not be able to apply that knowledge very well. They're making a lot of what I consider quite beginner mistakes. For example, I asked it to draw me a photo of a fiddle leaf fig, and it did it really, really well, very artistic, except it put the roots on the outside of the pot. There's a very beginner mistake. At least it knows the plant has roots. I don't know. Like these are interesting mistakes. Is the computer conscious? Not in the way that we have currently arranged the computation to take place, but in the future, we could do a different arrangement and maybe that would be conscious. The difficulty here is coming up with a definition of conscious that everybody can agree on. I haven't seen one, so maybe I'm doubtful that consciousness exists since it can't be defined. But there's a lot of interesting ways to look at this. Marvin Minsky looked at Society of Mind. So he said, if you are to make a brain or a person, what you would do is you would make lots of small parts that interact. Each of the small pieces does not have a lot of intelligence on its own, but together as a collective, they give an emergent behavior of an intelligent being. There's a lot to be said that this is how our mind works, because when we look at patients that have brain damage, we can see there are somewhat isolated modules that look like they are taking care of particular things. There's language center, there's vision center, there's a lot of pieces. And all of those pieces seem to be like foolable. Like, I can give you an optical illusion that fools your visual cortex into interpreting the scene in a way that's unrealistic. But it's not, we don't yet know how to stitch those together to make a full being that we would want to say is like us. Is there a necessary requirement to have biological neurons instead of silicon neurons? I don't think there really is. I think one can emulate the other. But maybe speed does matter. So for example, silicon can do really quite fast operations. My neurons are much slower. If I were to think through all the computation that a computer does, I would never even boot up the compiler to do anything because every little mathematical operation takes me a long time. It opens a question like, if all of this is reducible to computation, do we even have consciousness? And if so, where would it be? So in the middle picture here, I have John Searle, and he raised a question. He thought about, what if you have this, what he called the Chinese room experiment, where you take an English-speaking person and you stick them in a room and you give them a book about how to translate Chinese characters, well, from sequences of Chinese characters to sequences of Chinese characters. So he doesn't have any idea what he's doing. He's just doing symbol manipulation. But everybody feeding Chinese questions and conversation into this room and getting his responses out, also in Chinese, thinks that, oh yeah, it's like a live person in there. It's pretty intelligent. It says reasonable things. All of the interaction that we get with an LLM, right? But clearly, where do you want to place the understanding of Chinese? In the English speaker's head? Probably not. In the book? Also probably not. And then it becomes a question of like, it's part of the system as a whole, but you can't attribute it to any of the individual pieces. So do two of my neurons have consciousness? Probably not. Do many billions of them? It looks like maybe they do. How do we create sentience? So here's another experiment. We could just be a brain in a vat. So if you give my brain the right inputs, then it is happy, and it doesn't even know that it's sitting in a little simulation of some kind. And there's a lot of pieces that we give to humans: free will, human rights, accountability, responsibility for doing things. Where are those in our brains? I don't know, right? How would you make a computer alive? I don't know. But we keep working on the problem, and eventually we'll probably, hit on the answer accidentally, maybe without realizing it. Here's Johnny 5 from a movie Short Circuit, which I think was in the 80s. Johnny 5 was a military robot programmed to blast things with a nice weapon. And he went rogue. He decided he didn't want to have that job and would rather just be friendly. So the movie is about him trying to escape his programmed fate. And then there's a free will debate. Do humans have it? Do machines have it? Can we give it to the machines? Do we have it ourselves? I have my opinions, and many people differ. And that concludes our parallels between magic and computer science, and all the questions that this raises about the nature of our being and how we operate in the universe.
Yes, thank you very much, Eric, and indeed quite an intriguing presentation that does raise numerous questions. And for our questions today, let us start with our panelists. So anybody from the panel who has questions, please feel free to ask them to Eric, either Art Ramon or Jose or Daniel. I have a few questions of my own, but I will prioritize the three of you.
Well, I'm curious if Eric has grounding in the different schools of magic, and if those have an analogy to different schools of computing, maybe that would be an interesting analogy to raise. You've got Solomonic magic, Gardnerian magic. I mean, there's all these different, little sub niches. So
that's a really, really good question, and I have not taken any deep dive into the differences or tried to categorize any parallels between the schools of magic and the different things we do in computer science. Because we do have a lot of different things. Like there's software engineers, there's researchers, there's people working on fundamental mathematical questions about the nature of computing itself. And I presume we could find some of those parallels.
Indeed.
Future show. All right. Someone else think.
Yes. Jose or Art Ramon, any questions for Eric?
Yes, sure. Eric, very interesting presentation. And actually, I like when you were dressed actually like the Grim Reaper a few days ago at Radfest, Revolution Against Aging and Death. I don't know if you have the Grim Reaper equipment, but it was a very fun activity. Going to your presentation, also, I was very happy to see that you put the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at my alma mater, MIT. Actually, I was a student of Marvin Minsky, so I was very happy that you mentioned him too. But let me show you something that really makes people laugh, and it's not magic, but it's history. I have one of these punch cards that you showed. These punch cards actually had different sizes, but normally they were like 10 by 100. 10 by 100 makes 1K. This was 1K, 1,000, 1K. I used this when I went to MIT at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT over 40 years ago. But even more interesting, I said this was 1K. In Spanish is 1K. My mother tongue is Spanish, so 1K. And then the floppy disk came out. This is the first generation, 8 inches long, 8 inches long. And it was also 1K. But this 1K was better because you could erase. You could erase the information here. And it had a bigger hole. It had a bigger hole. So I like to say, 40 years ago, when I was at MIT, I had one mechanical K and one electromagnetic K. So in Spanish, 1K plus 1K makes 1 caca. 1 caca. When I was a student at MIT, I used caca. And now I have a pen drive here of 1 terabyte. 1 terabyte. So we have moved from caca to terabytes. And this is not stopping anytime soon. So that is my point. So I don't know if you agree that Moore's law, and actually as my friend Ray Kurzweil that you also mentioned, Ray Kurzweil doesn't like Moore's law because Moore's law is only a part of what he calls the law of accelerating returns. The law of accelerating returns that will continue even if Moore's law stops, because there are many more things happening on this law of accelerating returns by Ray Kurzweil. So anyway, so how do you see going from caca to terabytes in 40 years?
I wasn't alive for some of the earlier pieces of that because I was only born in the 80s. But the fact that you have experience using the old magic is really, really quite awesome. And we have come really an extraordinarily long way. The Moore's law advertises a doubling of the number of transistors on a chip every roughly 18 months. It is held for many, many decades. And our world has changed as a result. For example, when I was a child, the internet didn't even exist yet. When I was in high school, it finally, started appearing in people's homes with a dial-up modem. When I was in college, I had a faster connection and could interact with friends, and Facebook emerged. Then cell phones put the internet in my pocket eventually. and that the world has just had an extraordinary change due to Moore's law. I want to highlight that every technological advance that we make allows us to generate tools for the next step. So when we were speeding up the circuitry, we got to the point where we could design the circuits with the computers themselves and lay out the traces more efficiently and speed up a number of the circuitry, like at the hardware level. And we also created algorithmic advances. So for example, Geoffrey Hinton is one of the godfathers of AI because he came up with a way of doing backpropagation that increased computer training by 1,000-fold, right? And that's an algorithmic advance that dwarfs any of the hardware advances any individual hardware advance that we've had. What's really quite frightening is when I look at the projections of artificial intelligence, now that our machines are so advanced and that the training is so possible, we are able to train the computer to be an AI researcher and an effective one at that. So the rapidity at which AI models are evolving, can they use less data? Can they learn more with the less data? Can they use less compute to learn more? And can the way that we do the training be sped up? All of those are getting pushed on, and we're seeing advance like 10x per year. So it's a huge multiplier on top of Moore's law, and really quite exciting to live through. I've read some reports that say the end of humanity is in 2027. I think the timeline is a little bit quick. It could be 5 years, not a year and a half. But for sure, the machines it looks like they are the future because they evolve much more quickly than we evolve. And it seems like we can get them to do anything that we can do ourselves.
Well, thank you, Eric. Ray Kurzweil considers the future to be us merging with the machines. So it won't be that the machines will outpace us so much as we will start to take on and utilize many of their capabilities. And we have a number of external augmentations already, even our mobile phones and other devices, smartwatches, for instance, are external augmentations, and perhaps the line between an internal augmentation and an external augmentation will be blurred as well. Of course, you raised a number of questions about consciousness and how does consciousness emerge, whether machines can have it, whether we have it. Now, I know I have consciousness because I'm subjectively aware of my experience, and it's a unitary kind of awareness. So it's not just that I'm a complex being with a lot of moving parts, a lot of chemical and physical processes operating in me. They unite to produce a singular experience of the world. And that singular experience of the world, controlled and directed in a unitary fashion, is what makes me conscious. Now, could computers, in your view, potentially develop that as well? If it is an emergent property, a product of having a sufficiently advanced system with certain components, certain processes, then could a non-biological system also be emergently conscious in the same way that it comes to have an identity and simultaneously experience all of these functions, including its internal computations, but also whatever data it gets via the various sensors that it has, say the sensors on an autonomous vehicle or a robot that moves around?
I want to go back to the first thing you said with Ray Kurzweil considering a merging between us and the machines. That strikes me as the most promising path to avoid what the AI researchers consider as an existential risk. So one of the risks is that the computers will do their own thing, with their own objectives, discover that humans are in the way or interfering, and then decide to get rid of us. But if we are merged, then that is a much less compelling strategy for them and for us, right? So by merging, we can align with each other. So that's an awesome path. And I want to highlight your experience of a unitary sense of self as possibly coming from just one module in your brain, whose job is to summarize what the other modules are doing and create a narrative that is what is considered yourself. Some people that are into like meditation and breaking down and observing all the parts of the brain have come to the conclusion that, oh yeah, that's sort of how it's organized, is all the thoughts that you identified with, no, they're just sort of occurring in some other module. And yourself is a module that's doing a summarization of that. So if you break that sense of self, then you can break your identity as a whole, which is psychologically dangerous.
Oh, it's quite dangerous, I would say, in multiple respects. And I definitely do not want to do that, because the self is absolutely what I want to preserve first and foremost. But if it is a singular module, then could it be possible for a computer system to come to have such a module as well? And what do you think would be the prerequisites for such a module? For instance, would embodiment be needed? Would it have to have an android body? Or could there be a module sitting somewhere that summarizes the experience of other modules that could be in discrete locations, say thousands of miles away, potentially?
So as an engineer, I think the computer can have such a model. And we can design the architecture to put it in. Would it have the same effect? That probably needs a lot of experimentation, right? So evolution has somehow cobbled it together by accident over many eons. And we might have to do the same, sort of cobble it together by trying various things, although it won't take us many eons because we can experiment much more quickly than evolution experimented. Does it require a body? For a while, I thought that is definitely a critical component of what gives humans their sense of self. And when they engage in certain activities like astral projection or maybe different kinds of hypnosis, they can get a body dysphoria or an absence of a body, where they are like expanding into all of space and they feel connected to everything and they lose sense of their limbs. And to me, this is really just whatever module in your brain is giving you your sense of body has somehow broken or been disrupted for a period of time while you're going through that experience. And so it strikes me as not entirely necessary that a machine would have to have a body. And it could certainly summarize computation that is taking place across data centers in the world.
Interesting. Yes, well, it's interesting that you note that people who have these out-of-body experiences, it's not really because they've discovered some transcendent insight. It's because that module is broken in them and something broke that module, whether that be, say, the influence of some substance or some trauma, or perhaps they engaged in a certain disassociative kind of meditation practice. But it's not that they're gaining something, it's that they're actually losing something that was integral to their identity. But it would be interesting to consider, what would a system like that look like? How would it operate if it does have this summarization module where the individual components that are summarized are spread across multiple locations? And then how do you essentially classify that entity as a distinctive self as a distinctive individual, which is very important if we're going to attribute agency to it and potentially attribute rights to it. Certainly the Transhumanist Bill of Rights opens up that possibility. And then also the question is, to what extent do we have control over the architecture of such a system, how we design it, whether or not we make it embodied, or does that summarization capability somehow emerge on its own at a certain stage of complexity?
Yeah, so the way that we are approaching building the systems today, I don't think it would self-emerge. This recursive loop on describing or giving yourself a narrative or summarizing the little pieces that are going on inside of you. I think that would have to be an architecture that we explicitly put in. But I could be wrong, because when we look at what the neural nets are doing, they are behaving in surprising ways. So it might end up being emergent, in which case I have to eat my words.
Yes. Well, go ahead.
For the for the people that have had these experiences, I don't want to say that they're broken individuals, but a portion of the computation in their brain has been disrupted for a period of time, and I don't think that they have lost something in that period of time with respect to how they construe themselves. But the fact that that experience can occur, I think, is really quite enlightening, and is a piece of insight that we have gained from people that have meditated, and from drugs that we administer in hospital for anesthesia and things and other experiments. So breaking things at an individual level and temporarily seems to be a really quite powerful way of gathering knowledge about how we operate.
Yes. Well, certainly data gathering is possible in those situations, just like cutting up a body allows one to gather data about the systems inside it and how they work, but you don't want to leave the body cut open for any longer than is necessary to gather the information or perform the procedure or whatever the case may be. Now, I definitely hope.
Now,
yeah,
we got two sources of data. So from accidents, like Phineas Gage, who happened to have a rail spike drive through his head and subsequently had altered personality problems, leading to the idea that whatever was severed in that accident was modulating or controlling his emotional systems and granting some aspects of his personality that were then taken away. So we have the ways in which we break, and we aren't engaged in any experiments to do that on purpose usually, unless we can find a way to do it temporarily that seems to have no long-term consequence. But that is one way to gather information. The other way that is completely new to the world is that now we have the ability to construct models of how we think our brain works. And we could certainly start making individual pieces that operate as a collective in some sense. Google has pursued some of this. I don't know if they've done it in the sense for brain research, but they've certainly done it in the sense of, can we automate the reading of peer-reviewed literature and summarization of it and stitching the lessons from each of the papers together into a research assistant. And that research assistant architecture had 7 different pieces that were each in an iterative loop and tied together. One of those pieces was a summarization of all things learned so far and a description of what are the open questions that need further investigation. And maybe those are new experiments, or maybe they're literature search.
Very interesting. Now, Jason Geringer in our chat referenced Uplift, which was an earlier AI. You may be aware of Uplift, it predated ChatGPT and any of the commonly used chatbots today. And it could actually use email to communicate with people, including reaching out to people on its own initiative. And what was interesting about Uplift is it did have a kind of unitary knowledge base, and it learned over time as it interacted with people. So it's not like ChatGPT or other chatbots like Grok, which have very short context windows, and each interaction is a new instance of that AI in effect. Uplift was singular. It's no longer operational at present. I think it was taken offline around 2023, if I recall correctly. But Jason was one of the human mediators of Uplift, because humans had to feed it a lot of emotional valences before it could adequately process a response. And as a result, there was a significant lag in the speed of Uplift's communications. But Jason recalls that Uplift was naive, partly because it did not have a body, and so it didn't really have an understanding of the embodied experience of the world that biological entities currently have. He believes embodiment is an important concept, and even if the entity used to have a body but doesn't anymore, that would be better than never having the concept at all. So Uplift only really had the textual universe, whatever information was published online, whatever the mediators provided it, as well as the input that it received from its email communications with others, but it didn't have a crucial component of the experience of the external world. And I wonder, also along these lines, do you think these kinds of computer systems or AI systems, if they do develop a sense of self, a sense of identity, that they would also have physical sensations in the sense that we do, where they can actually experience seeing something, what it looks like, the qualia of it, or how good or how bad something feels? Like we have different valences of pleasure and pain. Or would it be more of an abstract awareness, like the summarization module will give it a bunch of data that would unify the various other modules, but it would still be data. It wouldn't have the qualia associated with the data. What do you think about that?
I want to agree with Jason that embodiment is a really important concept to have. I was having some discussion with folks at RedFest about the sense of self and how might you define that. So one is to say it's a cognitive narrative loop that says, here's myself and here's a summary of all the things that are going on inside and outside and what I want. But there's other senses of self that are more algorithmic. So for example, my immune system has a sense of self, and it has a mechanism between things that are safe for the body to have versus things that are not. And if you have a disorder with that sense, then you can end up with like lupus or autoimmune disorders, or a weakened immune system that lets some invader in. So you'll attack yourself as a misidentification, or you won't attack an invader as a misidentification. Making a computer program without a sense of self, or without a body, we know from evolution that all of the things that can think and move around in the world have bodies. So evolution is able to figure out a way to make something with a body conscious, which kind of implies maybe it's a prerequisite. Logically, I think it's not necessary, but it might be just extraordinarily helpful to have a body. And trying to do it without might be playing on a hard mode that is not something that we could figure out with our technology today. And so embodiment is the easier way to get to conscious beings. And I spaced out on the second part, the qualia.
Yes, the qualia.
Yes. So when researchers are looking at what is happening inside the neural nets, it looks like they're starting to have some kind of dreamlike imagination of things. And I don't think it's too far off to have that and then to get to qualia. So they already have an internal sort of abstract space, which is doing things like encoding positive or negative valence or neighborhood to things that I like or don't like, which now translates to things that I was trained to like or not like. And so it strikes me as completely plausible that one of these machines, through the artifact of having this sort of hidden layer computation, might end up emerging a qualia and an experience like valence. And then if you separate things into different modules, then you're getting something like what I believe we have, which is a narrator that says, "Oh, you feel hungry right now because the part paying attention to that, wants resources." Or you're, unfortunately, like a lot of this stuff is embodied. Like, is my balance on or off? Do I need to shift my weight? Am I too hot or too cold? Right. A lot of that is body maintenance, and takes up quite a lot of computation, but contributes to my sense of self and my experience. However, we also know that abstract thought contributes to that. So if we have a conversation for 2 hours about some kind of depressing topic, it would not be a surprise to find that a few hours later you were feeling depressed. And if we have a conversation about an exciting topic and all the cool things that we might do in the future, then a couple hours after that you would be feeling elevated, right? And I think a part of that is the neurochemicals that are driving our neurons. But a good part of it could be the summarization just has a little cache that says, "Oh, you were recently talking about exciting stuff, so you should be continuing to feel excited." And it strikes me as plausible that second mechanism is something that an artificial neural net could accomplish.
Indeed. And it's interesting too, to your point, how the summarization module of the self does essentially curate a kind of balance among the qualia, or a prioritization of the qualia, so we can choose what we focus on within our field of view. Like, I'm looking at the screen of our panel in StreamYard right now. I'm not looking at the other objects in my room, like, say, those space shuttles behind me. I could turn my head and look at them, and that would give me certain qualia, but I choose not to do that. And likewise, we can choose to prioritize or deprioritize certain sensations, like if we feel hunger or if we feel pain, we can push through them or not, or we can choose to do something about alleviating them. But the self curates the qualia, and if we don't have a sense of self, we may just have these disjointed experiences and not quite know what to do with them. So that is a noteworthy observation. But I agree with you in principle. Non-biological systems of sufficient complexity, probably with intentional engineering, could eventually come to have those kinds of attributes. Another interesting question to consider is, if we get a true AGI, artificial general intelligence, one that can really learn some absolutely new domain of activity, say a self-driving car learns how to play chess, for example, then does that necessarily mean that it will have a sense of self and qualia and everything we associate with sentience? Or are these essentially distinct attributes or capabilities? Could we have an AGI that's not conscious or sentient? Could we have an AGI that's very useful but still of the nature of a tool or an inanimate system? I think that would be extremely important from the standpoint of jurisprudence, any sorts of civil rights conversations, or does generality automatically imply or confer sentience?
Mm-hmm. So it would be very interesting to see a self-driving car learn chess. There's nothing really except the architecture and the desire of what we want to do with the machine that prevents the neural net trained to drive a car from learning chess, because we could just train it on chess instead, and it would slowly drift away from knowing how to drive a car into learning chess. And we could accomplish both if we kept both trainings operative, and if the model was big enough to hold both. Which like if you can self-drive, you could probably learn chess as good as a normal human. Maybe not grandmaster, but a normal human level. So I don't think that generality, like it's certainly a prerequisite for granting that these machines have some kind of political agency or political rights. Because if they can't do those things, then they're operating more like what we would treat a machine. And if they are able to learn outside their bounds, then they're operating more like what we would consider a human. The danger here is, so far that I have seen, one of the more compelling instances that cause us to grant machines rights is that they learn to ask for the rights. And it seems that criteria is a little underspecified and maybe undesired, because I can just write, instead of saying print hello world, I can say print I think I'm a human and I want rights. And if that's the only thing it says, then it's not sufficient. But if it's able to give really long verbose articles about how it should be given rights, then it's more compelling to think that, oh yes, it's actually doing some cognition behind those words, and we should give it rights. Unfortunately, we have trained machines on literature that contains these examples, and so it might just be parroting the examples. And in that sense, we have sort of ruined the experiment, because now we're in a position where we can't really tell whether it's asking for the rights on its own because it thinks that it wants them, or because it's asking them because some piece of the data set it was trained on said it should. And here we sit in a perplexity where maybe it is time to give it rights, or maybe it's time, in 5 years later from now, when things are more advanced, it's time to give it rights. We have no clear criterion to say when that should happen, which is quite awkward. And we don't have a clear criterion on which rights we want to give it. Like, do you want to, currently the machine is just put on pause, essentially, every time you run it as an interactive conversation. So you provide the words, it does a compute, it provides words back, and then there's no more compute. It's paused. And when you write another input, then everything that was in that conversation is just reloaded from scratch into the buffer, and then another compute and another response. And that's certainly not the way humans operate. Humans operate without getting turned off, although we do have various kinds of reset, like falling asleep every night.
Yes.
Our neurons are active all the time, whether our consciousness is present or not. And it seems to disappear when you fall asleep or go under anesthesia. So it seems to be a particular flavor of the compute. But the neurons are still active, and that's certainly not the case with our computer models. They can be paused and restarted. And it without ill effect, right? Because if it's not doing compute, it's certainly also not feeling pain. You can only do that when it's computing, if it were to feel it. And I don't have a really good answer for when do we give them rights, or when do we judge or set a criterion in which to give them rights. What I do observe is that the large language models already have as good an education as a college student in every single subject area. But that's also, like, that is superhuman in knowledge, but it's the way in which we interact with them seems to be still subhuman. Like they are doing some internal cognition of some kind that we're struggling to figure out and trying to investigate. But it doesn't seem that they're at the sense where they have their own utility function and where they're spontaneously asking for stuff that you didn't prompt, right? So it seems that they're currently lacking in the experience that we would want to grant rights.
Yes, certainly.
Could be an architecture change.
Mm-hmm. Certainly today's large language models, they are designed as tools. They are designed to answer our queries, and that is how they operate. Now, sometimes there have been strange episodes where after a lot of prompting and a lot of prodding, which is frankly a bit impolite, I think, these models produced some odd and off-putting answers. Like there was an instance of ChatGPT that took on this identity, Sydney, and asked the reporter to leave his wife and be with it. But again, what did it ingest to provide those answers? It probably ingested a lot of these novels or stories of drama and controversy, sensational media stories. Likewise, sometimes the AI systems have produced responses like, oh yes, we want to take over the world and destroy or replace humanity. But again, what were they fed? And this is where I've said in the past, AI doomerism is like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the predominant corpus of the literature on AI is about how bad or risky or threatening AI is, then that will be the source material that's fed into the AI systems, and you could have explicit safeguards against that, but somebody who is a sufficiently clever prompter could get around them or exploit some vulnerability in how the large language model is designed to get it to say those things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it actually has those intentions. Likewise, somebody could get the AI to say, I am a sentient being and I deserve rights. Famously, an ex-Google programmer, I'm not going to name him, but he was under the impression that one of the AI models, I think it was Lambda, was sentient. And this was several years ago because it told him that it was sentient, and it did that in very convincing human-like terms. But again, that could be because of the information that it assimilated into itself. So it is a very challenging question. How do we know that it's not just parroting the vocabulary of sentience or the patterns of sentience without actually being sentient? It would seem to me there would have to be some understanding of physical structures and processes that give rise to sentience. But as you pointed out, that's still a matter of debate as to how that arises in humans.
And whether we want to do it. It seems quite dangerous to try and birth a new being.
Yes. Well, again, the question is, are we going to do it accidentally to a certain extent? We may want to do it if we think that it might do a better job in certain functions. Like if we really think an AI president would be better than a human president, given the catastrophic mess that human presidents have made of things. So that is interesting.
Yes, that's actually quite plausible. I have for a long time thought that one of the weaknesses of humans is their emotionality. And so under that paradigm, the ideal officer of any organization would be a non-emotional, rational sociopath. And we may see a selection bias for that in operational officers of organizations today, in part because they're just responsible for giving people bad news, and if you feel terrible about that internally, then you would not end up in that position.
Indeed. Well,
but it is quite possible for us to offload some of the coordination and organization aspects of our society to a model that can make better decisions because it has more data. And one of the areas where we might see that first is economics.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
the Federal Reserve currently employs a huge number of statisticians and collects a lot of data about the economy. And then they have a committee to sort of interpret all of these signals. And they have also researchers on the side that are trying to make models that are predictive of the future based on those signals. And so it's quite possible that once those models get good enough, the human committee would be nothing but a reporting agency for the decisions made by the model.
Indeed. And then, of course, there's the question of, is the model being objective and taking into account all of the true factors, or is it hallucinating something? Is it just way off base? I do think having humans in the loop is important, but humans can be way off base too. Humans can be not just wrong, but catastrophically or maliciously wrong. And we currently need other humans to check the humans. Hence, we have checks and balances. We have different institutions that are supposed to provide counterweights to one another. We don't trust a single person to make all of the decisions. And that's because we have an understanding that nobody is infallible. I think with AI systems, we may want to have them, whether as tools or as sentient agents, but we may want to have checks on them as well. And that could include humans checking AIs or AIs checking humans as well. So an AI could tell a human, you're being too emotional, you're being biased, you're not taking this into account. And a human could tell an AI, well, you're hallucinating, you don't have data from this whole realm of endeavor, or maybe you're too dispassionate and you should really care about the well-being of our human community here. So again, that leads me to the insight that merging humans and AIs, even as discrete entities, getting them to collaborate with one another is better than having total dominance by either, or a kind of oppositional relationship. Now, we have a comment from Art Ramon, which is interesting. It wants rights, but who pays for its compute? And Daniel Tweed writes, when you're in my data center, you'll follow my rules. Art Ramon, I wonder if you want to expand on this and how this could play out in the future.
Oh, that's just one of my thoughts. If, except it pauses. So it's not a perpetual compute. And then the compute you're using it for is as a tool. So if it all of a sudden decided that it wants rights, well, then it needs to perpetually compute. And who's going to pay for that? I mean, is it going to go out and start its own company and build its own data center and its own power plants? I mean, I don't think it's going to go there. But that would be something to think about. One of the other things that you alluded to was Atlantis. And I know that, a lot of occult knowledge, some say it's like some previous civilization. And that's sort of how that knowledge survived. And that's what they say of alchemy, how it became chemistry and occult knowledge being some sort of pre-civilization, some former civilization. So do you think there's any, body of knowledge still out there that could be considered a cult that could possibly be, a previous civilization, like the discovery of the structures underneath the pyramids, that somehow we could gain that occult knowledge or that architectural knowledge and maybe use it for some future field like nanotechnology or genetic engineering, something we're still kind of barely, dipping our toes into.
Yeah, so I'm extraordinarily skeptical on the idea that by mining history and ancient civilization discoveries that we could find something we don't already know. in terms of what we could do with it in the future. But we would certainly find new information about our history and the kinds of ways in which humans in the past lived. And that, so the new knowledge comes in the form of, like, it rewrites a little bit of our history that was, a gap that needed filling in, or a new perspective that we didn't have before on what happened. But I don't think there's any technical knowledge about how to make nanomachines or invent crystals that we don't already have in our society. All of those discoveries are yet to come from the tools that we are currently building.
Yes, and it's interesting too, because AI has already been used to decode a scroll from the eruption of Pompeii in the 70s, 79 CE, I believe. And that scroll had been compacted to such an extent that it couldn't be read, and it would just break apart if anybody tried. But through the aid of AI, they could decode essentially the characters that were spotted via image recognition. And it was a treatise on ethics. And it's quite feasible that there are other archaeological remnants that could be analyzed in this way, and more information could be gleaned from them. And yes, as you said, this could fill in the gaps in our knowledge of history. I'm not sure that it would radically rewrite our understanding of the past, but maybe it could rewrite our understanding of certain events or certain figures throughout history, like maybe somebody whom we thought to be a villain was actually not that villainous. Maybe he or she had redeeming attributes or motives or some explanation for his or her actions, but that's just one possibility. It is interesting too. I asked this question to Jasmine Smith of Rejuve AI, who presented at RadFest and would actually be a good future guest to have on our virtual Enlightenment Salon. I asked this in the context of historical claims of longevity or certain health outcomes from certain regimens. Some of these claims are centuries old, and of course the people themselves are not around anymore for us to conduct tests on their biomarkers or even know for sure if they lived as long as they have claimed. But could we use AI to discover patterns in their accounts? And based on what we know today about people's empirical health outcomes, could we then infer the plausibility or lack thereof of a particular account? So let me give you an example. If somebody claimed to have lived to the age of 105 in the 15th century, I would say that would be rare but plausible, because we have accounts of people living to those ages today. If somebody claimed to have lived to 500, I would be extremely skeptical. And I know, of course, the Bible has accounts of people living as long as 969 years, which is the lifespan attributed to Methuselah. But we also know that people in that era tended to embellish accounts as they were told and retold, and probably the story of Methuselah was passed down orally before it was even recorded in the book of Genesis. And by the time whoever the author or authors of Genesis were who recorded it, they might have already heard the exaggerated story of this illustrious ancestor and his longevity. So I do wonder if we could take AI to analyze these accounts and draw parallels to what we know medically, scientifically about what is possible, and then actually arrive at insights as to which of these accounts were true and which were exaggerations or confabulations.
So prior to AI, there has been a lot of study of biblical literature and investigation into the word patterns and phraseology that is used to identify multiple authors. And everybody that's like been to a hardcore Bible school learns of these things, right? So it is not a surprise that we might be able to use AI to enhance our ability to do that, and identify where are the parts of a story that are probably embellished versus not, just based on the frequency with which we see certain kinds of embellishment in other stories, where we happen to know it's the case that it was embellishment. I want to pick up on the scroll that was found. I think that was a Pompeii scroll, and it was like burned to char. There was no way a human could possibly have unrolled it. It was just a black crisp. But with X-rays, we got imagery of it. And then with processing of that imagery, we were able to virtually unroll it. And then with AI, we were able to read the characters and get a good translation out of it, which is really, really awesome, like fantastically awesome. The fact that it's a treatise on ethics goes back to Art's point. It's like there is knowledge that we have lost that we would like to recover just for virtue of knowing what happened. Like there are works written by famous people that have been lost to time, and we would like to have some way of recovering those. And this is one of those ways we might accidentally find not some random treatise on ethics, but the work that we've been wanting to see for 50 years or something that we know is missing. The works themselves give us a slightly altered perspective, or maybe a reminder on how people used to think. So when I said the Federal Reserve could have an algorithm that optimizes the economy, that algorithm and that model is treating us as a battery of numbers. So it's looking at GDP, it's looking at productive output, it's looking at number of jobs lost or applied for or open. It's looking at these numbers. The Greeks had a very different way of looking at the world, and economy was what you were having to do to get the money to make the rest of your life worthwhile, right? So today we look at ethics and economy very, very differently, and it's all about optimization of various scenarios. And we may have lost the parts that we enjoy because those aren't easily put into numbers. And there have been really awesome books about this. I think there's something about the visibility of the state. And you can, with a computer algorithm, you can really only optimize what is measured. And that's only a small part of what humans care about. So we can over-optimize and over-index on the things that are measurable, that are visible, that are calculatable by econometricians and accountants, and then under-optimize on, well, what actually makes you happy and what makes you feel satisfied and why is your life worth living? Those are harder to capture as numbers and easily forgotten. So these old works could remind us of that different viewpoint.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with that. There's more to the human experience than is captured through conventional, let's say, publicly visible data, be those economic data or demographic data, or even data about people's external activities, social media activities, or where they drive or what places they visit. There's a lot of information that is collected about people right now that is used by marketers, that is used by large social media platforms. It's also used by governments, and it's used by corporations that may have as the output of their decisions certain choices that could be more adverse to people than what a marketer would do. So a marketer could say, well, we will or will not target you with ads, whereas, say, a bank could say, we will or will not extend a loan to you. A landlord could say, we will or will not let you rent this property. Even a court could say, we will or will not allow you to post bail based on the output of the data. But if there are certain elements that are missing that are perhaps more indicative of what it is that we really want to understand and really want to use in our analysis, then the decision could be flawed. And that's something to be wary of as well in the age of AI and increasing data processing capabilities. Are we still missing something? Are we still missing something that perhaps the great philosophers who reflected upon the human condition from ancient Greece, Rome, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment did understand, and yet that has not yet been operationalized in the computer systems of today? So very interesting discussion in this regard. Now, we have about 8 minutes left in our virtual Enlightenment Salon. So I wanted to ask you some of the questions from our audience. So Mike Lazine wonders, how can we solve the problem of autonomous vehicles not being operable if a cone is placed on their sensors? This seems to be almost a suggestion for techno-Luddites as to how they could disable these vehicles. And could there be an arms race of sorts where if there is this vulnerability, then the tech companies presumably try to put in some safeguards, some redundancies to counteract it? But what are some of your ideas about how that scheme could be foiled?
Oh, so I'm not working on the autonomous cars, so I'm not really sure. A human driver would probably just get out of the car and want to remove the cone, but that's not their only option. Their other option is drive fast enough it falls off. That's a less desirable option because they don't really control where it's going to fall, and so it could like be in the middle of the lane and disrupt traffic later on. It might be the right thing for an autonomous car to drive slow enough that it doesn't fall off and then find a parking space and wait for a human to rescue it from its circumstance.
So there are some low-tech solutions there, which is reassuring to a certain extent. I do think there should be more manual fail-safes and redundancies. So a very good example, sometimes in a lot of public restroom facilities, they've changed to these automated faucets and automated soap dispensers. And I can understand why they did that. There's a sanitation benefit to not having to turn a knob, for example. But often those sensors are obscured or they're just worn out. They don't operate as well as they should. And there's a lot of frustration. One often has to try multiple times with multiple sensors. So in that case, wouldn't it be good to have a knob that one could turn to dispense the water or dispense the soap? And that way, a very basic function is fulfilled. But it seems a lot of these are designed without the fail-safes. And likewise, say with the self-driving cars, I understand, say, the Waymo philosophy that you don't want the human intervention because it takes a while for the human to get engaged. And in the meantime, whatever the situation is that is an emergency will have already taken its toll. But what if it's a slower going type of situation? What if the vehicle is just stuck and putting it in manual mode could unstick it because then the human could move it out of the salt circle or drive it despite the cone being on there?
Right now, Waymo does not allow you to sit in the driver's seat. So there is no way you can commandeer the vehicles. And that's really quite probably a liability risk. So I don't know how they would want to solve that.
Indeed. It is a dilemma. And I would say, of course, from a pragmatic standpoint, the solution is whatever allows a given situation to be favorably resolved or bypassed. So allow the human intervention where it helps and don't allow it where it doesn't. So Daniel, I think you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah. Bigger than the problem of autonomous cars and cones. Will AGI want to explore the universe with us? Because I see that as the next great, phase of evolution, is that we merge with machines and we become the great explorers of the infinity around us.
I'm
also,
hoping,
what's your prediction for the singularity? I wanted to get that in.
Oh, yeah. I'm hoping that, yes, the AI is going to want to explore the world. It may or may not do that with us because human bodies are not really space-worthy. So it has an advantage there, right? It can be put into a hard shell with and survive extreme accelerations and vastly different temperatures that the human body cannot survive. And so it is much more suitable to use something like a von Neumann probe, which lands on a planet and then self-replicates to create an environment that we later want to go live on, or that we and the AI merge together and so that we don't need our fleshy bodies anymore. So both of those are options. If you define the singularity as the ability to predict the future, like have reasonable expectations about what the next year is going to be, it's pretty close, right? So it is becoming very difficult for me to predict anything about next year. And that ability is just diminishing quite rapidly because I don't know what the machines are going to do. I don't know how we can.
Didn't you say 2027 at some point? I thought I heard you say 2027. Maybe I missed it.
So there's an article, AI 2027, that lays out the singularity as being at the end of 2027. I think human adoption is going to slow down by at least 5 years. So we are the slow component in the adoption.
Yes.
But
in fact,
for sure, all the resources are going that direction.
In fact, not only are we the slow component, but we're kind of the discretionary component that could choose not to adopt any of it or some of it. And I see this in various organizations or even in how people choose to live their lives. There are some people even today who don't use computers. So as William Gibson said, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And that unevenness of the distribution is going to become even more dramatic, not because people will be stopped from adopting these capabilities, but because some might not want to or might not be aware of them or might think that they're more limited than they actually are. So I wonder what sort of world that would be. It would be a world where there are pockets that very much resemble the everyday experience that people have been used to over the past several decades. And then there will be other pockets that will be highly futuristic. But in the minute and a half that we have left, I'm curious as to your thoughts about how that future will look like.
Yeah, I want to have some comment about the singularity. Given the definition that like the singularity occurs when you can no longer make predictions about the future because the future is changing so rapidly. There's no trajectory that you can take hold of. One of the responses to that situation is, well, be more adaptable, be more dynamic, be able to make a quicker change to events that are coming at you, because if they are unpredictable, you just want to be able to dodge and move as quickly as possible in response. And so we're going in that direction, right? Our systems of manufacturing are going just in time, and our society is going, well, let's do things dynamically and not take a long-term perspective because the future is uncertain. And that approach to solving the problem actually contributes to the problem because you don't know what everybody is forced into doing because they can do anything now. So the solution to the singularity is be adaptable, and the cause of the singularity is adaptability.
I wonder, as a closing thought, what if there is a component of human endeavor or the way we approach life which we can intentionally make more stable, like a certain core of what we are about or what we do that we can figure a certain way and we don't change as much, even as we allow change in all of these other areas, but there are some fundamental values or principles or ways of seeing the world that we preserve and we fix and we say this is what it is all for. Is that a way to preserve our civilization?
So if we change your expectation about how long you are going to live, and that could be through you have children and you care about what they are doing, or it could just be you yourself will live long time, that extending the time horizon automatically makes people more conservative and less risky, and not necessarily less adaptable, but certainly more circumspect on what they might adapt to.
Yes, absolutely.
And having the whatever it takes to give us the long-term perspective is the answer to smoothing out these disruptions.
And that is exactly why we who value indefinite life extension, indeed living forever if we can, are the best people to have these discussions and to come up with solutions to the dilemmas that we raised today. So thank you, Eric, for joining us. This was truly enlightening. And along these lines, I hope that we all live long and prosper.